Thank you very much. We're all good audio. Oh yeah, we're really good audio-wise. Thank you very much for coming. I'm very excited to be here. I am also very conscious it is 4:15 in the afternoon and I am one of two people standing between you and a cold beer, so hopefully I will keep things reasonably entertaining. So to get you on side, I'm going to start off with what everybody really loves to do. That's some audience participation, but it will be quick. If you could just raise your hand if you have built a Shopify app or if you've ever been involved in a Shopify app, some API stuff. Cool, well that's roughly a third of the room. That's awesome. So my goal for today, regardless of whether you raised your hands or not, is to have you leaving today really excited about custom app development for Shopify and thinking about how you might be able to bring it into your own business as a service offering. For those of you who are experienced app developers, and I know that there are clearly a few of you in the room, maybe some of the things we'll be talking about what we do will give you a different perspective, or maybe things that you might be able to bring into your own processes. So first of all, who am I? Quick introduction. Why am I standing up here talking about custom application development? I've founded an agency called Disco. This is the team. There's our cheesy Christmas photo from this year. And we are focused on exclusively developing custom Shopify apps for merchants. I think we are one of the few, if not the only, Shopify Plus partner that focuses exclusively on doing that for people. I think we have about 20 to 30 apps in deployment at the moment, and while we certainly haven't got everything figured out about the app space, I would say we have a decent amount of experience, and that's kind of what I want to draw on when I'm talking to you guys today. So in terms of what I want to cover, firstly, what do I actually mean when I say custom app development? And then probably more importantly, why should you care as a Shopify partner? What are the benefits to you? Assuming that I convince you of that, and I'm pretty convincing, so I'm sure we'll get there. I want to talk a little bit about some of the things involved in the scoping, the pricing, the selling of custom app projects, some things that we've run across or things that you might be able to take away. And then finally, if I have time, I'd just like to talk a little bit about some of the opportunities beyond that. Once you've got a couple of custom app development projects under your belt, where do you go from there? What can you do? Just as important as what I will be talking about is what I won't be. So I won't really be digging into anything around technical implementation, so I won't be talking programming languages or app architecture or anything like that. I'm not going to be talking about any apps for the App Store or marketing those apps. There's just way too much wrapped up in those two topics. And then finally, I'm really conscious that everyone has a pretty unique sales process. So what I'll be talking about later on is not so much a prescriptive, this is what you should do when you're selling an app project. It's more about high-level stuff to think about, things that might be a bit different in an app project versus a theme or store build or something like that. All of that said, if you are interested in any of these, I will talk your ear off about it, so please grab me for a drink or office hours afterwards, and I'll happily have a chat. Okay, so the definitional question, what do I actually mean when I say custom application development? To focus firstly on the application development part of it, I guess what I mean by that is really software that's going beyond what's possible with Shopify out of the box or with custom themes. So as many of you would know, the amount of stuff you can do with Shopify out of the box is actually pretty powerful. So with Liquid, JavaScript, CSS, HTML, you've got complete control over the front end of the site. And you can actually do quite a lot of stuff with that. So things like product upsells or product customizers, customer-specific pricing, stuff that actually a lot of merchants will run to a custom app or to an app from the App Store for. A lot of that's actually achievable with just some clever use of the inbuilt concepts in Shopify and some clever theme development. But there are limits to what you can do there. So any time that you start thinking about changing the underlying data in Shopify, so updating or editing products, if you need to start talking to an external API or an external service, or even if you have concepts in your app or in what you want to do that don't really fit in with the Shopify data model, that's when you start to get to the limits of what Shopify can do out of the box and what theme development can do out of the box, and that's when you sort of need to look at custom software. So I'm talking about software that is dealing with those sorts of things and addressing those problems. The second part is the custom part of it, and what I guess I think of when I think of that is it's a one-off thing. It's something that you're tailoring in a bespoke way for one specific client. So you're working with a client one-on-one to build something that meets an exact, precise need that they have. So it's not something that you build and then take to the App Store, or you build and try to sell, then you try and find your clients. You're working really closely with the client to make sure you build something that's 100% tailored to what they need. To give you some examples of the sorts of things that we've done that fit into this category, this is sort of a architecture diagram for a returns app that we built for a client. So they returns itself, not built into the Shopify platform, and some of the apps in the App Store do 70% of what this client needed, but for them they had a very specific process they wanted to take their returns through. So for them, they saw the ROI to build a custom app that was lined up exactly with what they wanted to do. So you can see it's got a customer interface section, it had an interface for the customer support team, a completely separate section for the warehouse team, and then it had some funky integrations with Ship Engine and Zendesk as well, so lining up exactly what they wanted. This is a much simpler example, but also something that I'd consider custom app or bespoke development. So data migrations, very common use case for API integrations or custom development. You've got a legacy system, you want to move a customer over to Shopify. There's not an existing tool to do that, so you have to write some bespoke custom code that pulls out the data in the way the client wants and ports it across to Shopify. The reverse of that as well, very common use case. In order to get placed in Shopify, you want to push it out to an external system, an ERP or a warehouse. Again, if it doesn't have an existing integration with Shopify, then often you'll need to build that. Sometimes there is an existing integration, but there's some complex business logic that's specific to that client. So maybe they only want to send orders across that are over a certain value, or they want some flagging rules or something like that. So again, there's often a need for some custom logic and code there. And then this is sort of going down the rabbit hole. You can get into this territory, this is a network of 5. I think we have 6 now, custom apps for this one specific client, all handling different bits and pieces of their infrastructure and how they process and manage and sell their orders. So we have data analysis tools, recurring orders apps, one-click checkout stuff, something to manage their delivery zones that in turn provides an API to a mobile app. So all of this is highly bespoke and custom software, all sitting on top of the Shopify platform, but tailored in a way that meets exactly what this customer needed to do. So that's kind of the what when I'm talking about custom app development, and then it comes to the why. So if you're a Shopify partner that's currently offering store setup or theme developments, marketing, strategy, that sort of stuff, why would you be interested in adding custom application development to your skill set? And that's a pretty legitimate question because there are costs involved. It's not just a matter of you flick a switch and suddenly you're offering app dev. There's obviously a time investment. You have to learn how to actually build these apps in the first place. There's also a people investment. So if you're running an agency, you have to start looking at either hiring people in with these skills or training up the existing staff that you do have. There's obviously a cost and a time involved in that. Typically, app developers are more expensive than front-end employees, so there's that to consider. There's also the overhead of working out how do you fit this new service offering into your overall packages. How do you sell it to clients? How do you pitch it? How do you get it across the line? So there's a lot of overhead there. And then finally, I guess this kind of relates back to what Dylan was saying earlier. I'm a big fan of specialization as well. I run an agency that does only custom app development for Shopify. So I certainly understand his point about the power of specialization. So if you're making this decision for yourself, these are some things you have to think about. But there are some upsides as well, and I'd say probably the biggest one that I would advocate for is that having some custom app dev skills gives you what I would call partner superpowers. So I spoke a little bit earlier about the fact that you have these limits with what you can do with Shopify out of the box, and if you're doing custom theme development as well. Custom app dev skills remove those limits. So you're sort of opening yourself up to doing anything that you can do with software for your clients on Shopify. And anything that software can do is a pretty broad scope. So you really do have a lot more flexibility, a lot more scope for the size and the types of projects that you're taking on. You are still obviously going to be constrained by your time and the budget that you have with these clients, but having the custom app dev lets you change the conversation a little bit from things like, if client's asking you something, you can say, well, yeah, we don't really do that, or yeah, you'd have to talk to this other agency for that. You can change that conversation to, yeah, we can do that. Let's have a conversation about what's involved, what we're going to have to do to get there, what the budget, what the timeline's going to look like. And so that's true even if you're talking about really, or what I consider smaller custom app development projects, or even things like scripts. So I'm sure that all of you that have launched a store for a client have had the last minute call from a client saying something like, oh, I just realized that all of our descriptions on our products are in American English. We need to change it to Australian English because they copied them off Amazon or something like that. They don't want to have to go through and edit 5,000 SKUs themselves. But if you've got some scripting skills, you can step in and say, hey, no worries, we've got this covered. It'll take us a couple of hours to run a script to run through that and change that for you. From the client's perspective, you just save them a whole bunch of time and effort. They can stop stressing about that piece and focus on the other more important things around the launch. Custom app dev skills also gives you a deeper knowledge of the platform. So even if you're not actually doing dev work day to day in a custom app field, having that background will make you a much more valuable resource for your existing clients when they're coming to you with questions. So if they're asking you about, well, is this possible? What sort of price are we talking for something that'll do this integration? Again, even if you're not pricing and scoping that yourself, if you have a bit of knowledge around the custom app dev, you're more likely to be able to say, oh yeah, I've seen that done before. The price range for that was about $5,000 to $10,000. That's probably what it'd cost. You're not guaranteeing that, but you are able to give them a bit more of a scope and a ballpark. And again, you just are able to speak to clients with a bit more authority on this sort of stuff. The final thing about app development is that the number of Shopify partners that are able to build Shopify apps and that can do that really well is smaller than the number of partners that are focused on store setup or theme building. Certainly not saying they're completely incomparable skills or anything like that, but just if you look at the numbers, that's the case. So it does mean that you can pitch app development as a more premium service offering. You have opportunities to work on larger scale budgets and timelines, and also hopefully better margins. So assuming that that's maybe at least got you interested enough to listen to me for another 20 minutes, I'd like to talk to you a bit about the scoping, the selling, and the pricing. So some of the things that we've learnt when we're actually running these projects that we think are a little bit different to a theme development or a store setup project. So I set up the top that I wasn't going to try to be super prescriptive about a sales process or anything like that, but the odds are pretty good that most of you would be running with something that looks generally like this. You have a qualification stage where you're working out, is the client a good fit? Do you like them? Are they a tire kicker? Do they have budget? Are they a Collingwood supporter? All of that really as a local reference in my own city, which seems redundant, but you'll have that initial stage where you're working through that. Discovery phase, where you're learning a little bit more about the problem at hand, digging into APIs for external systems, just getting together the information you need to get to the next stage, which would be a proposal where you're getting a timeline and a budget together and sending that over to the client to sign off on. So what do you look for when it comes to app development at each of these stages? So the first thing during qualification, I think it's really, really important to be setting client expectations. And I think that's probably been a theme from all of the speakers today. I think it's doubly important when it comes to app development projects because they do tend to have higher budgets than customers think. You really do get the customers that come in that want a Facebook clone for $50. And it's not the client's fault that they may not have unrealistic expectations, but the sooner that you work out where their expectations are and rectify that, if there's a big difference, the better off you are, the better off the client is, because you don't want to be wasting everyone's time. So in terms of what we do to help with that, I'm not expecting you to be able to read that, but this is our contact form. We would try to push all new clients through this form at some stage. Up the top, it's just got a bit of information about who we are, the sorts of projects we work on, and then towards where the form starts, there's a hard number of the project budget floor that we work with, which is currently $10,000. Now, that serves just to be very upfront about if that's not where your head is at, then we're probably not a good fit. Now, you personally, you might in your own business have a number that's higher, you might have a number that's lower, you might not throw it in the client's face at this stage, that's perfectly fine. Again, it's your sales process is your sales process. But regardless of that, I think it's really important for app development projects to have a number in mind, to work out what's going to be profitable for you, and always be measuring up what you think the client's expectations are with what your expectations are. The second thing, which I think is really important during the qualification stage, is just to check the client's understanding of how Shopify apps actually work. So a lot of the clients that we would talk to would have a pretty good idea of how Shopify works in terms of it's a hosted SaaS solution, it's a platform that processes payments and does this other stuff, and that there's the idea of themes that you can customize. That they're pretty well across. But when it comes to apps, that's often not the case, especially if they're coming from a background with Magento or WooCommerce or something like that. So on those platforms, the plugins or the apps for those e-commerce platforms run on the same servers as the platform itself. There's a lot more tightly coupled integration. The plugins can do a lot more because of that, often to the detriment of the platform. And so there isn't really this notion of what you have in Shopify, which is an external app. So all Shopify apps run on their own servers. They communicate with Shopify only through an HTTP API. So that brings in a whole bunch of other new concepts. So things like API call limits, things like being restricted to what you can actually do via the API. And then, of course, the fact that they're running on an external server. So there's some maintenance, there's some hosting involved in that as well. And I think being able to have that conversation and talk your client through that difference and how that works is important for two reasons. The first one is it just makes you look good because you're educating the client. So they can say, oh, these guys know what they're talking about, they seem to have it figured out, and I appreciate them taking the time to walk me through that. And then the second thing is it just sets the scene for later on when you start talking about hosting costs and maintenance costs, and sort of making sure that they understand that there is an ongoing component to running a Shopify app if it's a custom one. At the discovery phase, I guess as we would all know, the longer you spend in the discovery phase, the better in terms of avoiding headaches further down the line. That's general advice. When it comes to app development projects, I think that a couple of the unique challenges revolve around the time investment that's required. So whereas I don't want to say that a theme development project is standard, but you are working with a pretty well-known set of tools, the Shopify platform, what you get with Liquid, what you get with HTML and CSS and JavaScript. As I mentioned before, with app development, you're pretty unlimited in terms of what you can do when it comes to software. So the scope of what you're doing can be quite a bit broader, and that does mean that often you'll need to spend more time in discovery calls, talking through the problem with the client and really getting to grips with what's going on there. You're very often talking with third parties. So a lot of the projects that we would do would involve using an API to talk to an external system or pulling in data from somewhere else. And so that means you're kind of reliant on those external systems as well. So you need to be looking at their documentation, reading through their APIs, getting a sense of what their data models look like, how that's going to translate to Shopify. And then there's stuff that documentation doesn't tell you as well, like is there actually a human being contact person at the other end with this third party? Do they respond to emails? Is the documentation actually even accurate, which so frequently it really, really isn't. Another problem that we run into with app development projects is that I think clients are reasonably good. I'm sure designers in the room will disagree with me here, but I think they're reasonably good at looking at a mock-up for a site and being able to give some sort of feedback on it. Sometimes it's the classic, make it pop more sort of feedback. But in general, I think they can look at a layout design and understand what's going on. When it comes to app development, you're very often talking about more abstract concepts, like just moving order data from system A to system B. And the fact that it's so abstract makes it quite easy to just do a bit of hand waving and just make assumptions about how that data is going to go or how it's going to translate from one system to another. So it's really easy for those assumptions to creep in and just be like, oh, well, our existing system did this particular bit of business logic and translated things from Chinese to English. I just assumed that your app was going to do that as well. Very easy for that sort of stuff to happen. And then the last thing, which I guess is kind of tied back to what I was talking about in the time investment, is that very often the reason that clients are coming to you for custom app development projects is that it's new. It's not something that exists or there's no existing integration for it. So you are more often than not running into a world where you don't know everything about the systems or it's not something that you've done before. So that's all a bit doom and gloom in terms of the discovery stage. Here are some things that you can do to help out with that. The first one, boringly, is expectation setting. Yeah, really fun stuff, but again, a theme for the day, I think. But that applies to not only yourselves internally in terms of saying, well, yes, we know this discovery is going to take longer than we would normally allocate for an app development project, so make sure that's on your schedule, but then also on the clients as well, so making sure they understand that you need to block out this 2 hours for sitting down with us and going through everything, and this is what you should have prepared before that meeting so that we can make the best use of it. Things like that really help. Checklist is something that we have for a couple of types of projects that we've done a number of times. So product customizers is probably one of the common use cases or things that people come to us. And we just have a checklist of standardized questions that are things that we'll see crop up quite often in those types of projects. So for a product customizer project, that might be something like how many SKUs are involved, do the options that you're selecting affect the price of the customized product, can customers upload logos, just a long list of this sort of standardized stuff. We might fill that in based on our initial call with the client and then hand it over to them to check and fill in the rest of the details that we've missed. So a pretty simple tool, but it's just something that just keeps you organized and makes sure that you're asking the same questions and don't get caught out by missing things time in and time out. And that checklist is something you'll develop over time with this, once you sort of get a sense for what the standard sort of projects that you're working on are. The final thing that I think is really useful, and especially when it comes to that question of that abstract concepts and nailing down what the precise scope of your app is, and that's a workflow description, which is just to sit down and ask the client to map out in a lot of detail what their current process for a particular problem is. So if they're exporting data from Shopify, doing some spreadsheet manipulation, and then sending that off somewhere, get them to sit down, write out every step of that process, record a screencast or something like that, have them talk through the process, get a really clear idea of that, and then ask the client to do exactly the same thing with their imagination of what the system, what the future is going to be like once this app is built. So get them to project exactly what they imagine life to be like once your app is built. And the difference between those two descriptions is kind of the scope of the project. Obviously, there's more detail you need to dig into and things like that, but it is a really useful tool for just uncovering those assumptions that are there or uncover things that you weren't really thinking the customer thought you were going to be handling with your app. No, one more. So at the end of that discovery process, hopefully you're at a stage where you are ready to start putting some numbers together and present that to the client in terms of timeline and budget. And I think the first thing that we all have to sort of just accept when it comes to estimations is that human beings really, really suck at estimation. We are so bad at it. And there are things you can do to get better at it. There are things you can learn from previous projects, but I think at the end of the day, you sort of just have to accept that what you're doing is guessing. It's an educated guess, your guesses get better, but you just have to be okay with the idea that, yeah, you're making an educated guess. Obviously, one of the biggest things that will affect whether you really care whether those guesses are right or not is whether you're billing on a fixed fee basis versus a time-based basis. I won't start a holy war amongst us all about which one is better, fixed fee, but We use both. And I'm sure that there are many of you that would use exclusively one, exclusively the other, or a blend. For us, for app development projects, we prefer to use a fixed fee model. There are two reasons for that. The first one being that we tend to find that clients are more comfortable with it. They like having a capped number that they can look at and factor into their budget. It gives them a sense of certainty. And even if that number is higher, sometimes much higher than what it probably would be on a times and materials basis, they still like that certainty. And then the second thing is that I just don't like being penalized for being efficient. If we can build an app in 5 hours that someone else can build in takes 10, we're delivering the same value, we should be getting paid the same. And if you start doing a time and materials basis, then you run into that issue. The risk of that, obviously, is that if you get your estimates wrong, then you're left holding the bag. And that has happened to us. It will happen to us again, in that we're not making as much margin as we thought we would on a project, or even losing money in some cases. That is a risk that you sort of just have to take unless you switch to T&M. But I don't think we'll be doing that for the reasons I mentioned. Obviously, you want to make sure that your estimates are getting better and better over time, and there are a couple of things that you can do. I think, sadly, the best thing that's going to help you with estimating projects, especially when we're talking about app development projects where there's a lot of novelty involved, probably the best thing is experience, but there's not really a slide I can show you that's going to convey that to you. So the next best thing is a spreadsheet, probably. This is sort of just an initial, it's I think the version 2 of our spreadsheet estimation tool, it's pretty straightforward. It's just plugging in numbers based on our rough estimates for each feature, and then we have some factors in there that multiply developer time to get a number for what we think will be involved from a project management time, and then QA time, deployment, and all that sort of thing. So that is an hours-based calculator, but that gives us sort of a base for where we think what it's going to cost us to develop, and then we look at the value delivered to the client and pitch based on that. So it's not so important what your actual process is, I think, for the estimation. The important thing is having a process and having something that is going to keep you accountable later down the track. So once you've actually delivered your project, you can go back and look at what you actually spent versus what you estimated and work out where the gaps in your guessing game are. The final thing that I would talk about around pricing is the Flexi Fund, and this is an idea that I stole from Ross Bailey, who runs a plus agency in Boston called Growth Spark. And the Flexi Fund is just a percentage that you add on top of your budget. For us, that's 15% at the moment. And the idea behind that is that it's meant to cover all of those inevitable little bits of scope creep that always happen in a project. So when you're doing a fixed fee, this is kind of your way of covering your ass when it comes to the scope creep stuff that time and materials, I guess, doesn't run into as much. So we've actually found this quite easy to pitch to clients because sophisticated clients understand that they want to have a bit of flexibility as the project moves along. They want to be able to be like, oh, well, actually, can we add these extra fields in here? Can we just change how this works slightly? Things that would normally be out of scope. And if you don't want to go through the process of a big change request to get that done, but you also don't want to be doing that work for free, this is a nice balance between those two things. So the client is told when you start getting into that space that, okay, that's no problem, we can make that change, but that's drawing down on your Flexi Fund. They can see that drop off as their project progresses, and they're not left surprised when that comes to zero and they're still asking for change requests. They'll be expecting like, oh, I understand, now it's time to pay. So that's worked pretty well. We haven't had too many problems selling that to clients. We won't refund the Flexi Fund if it's not used during the project, but it does carry over to things like maintenance or V2 requests, and we've never had a Flexi Fund that has not been exhausted. So finally, you've done your qualification, you've done your discovery, you've done your pricing, handed that off to the client. How do you get them to sign off on the proposal you send through? Hopefully you've been thinking about this from the very first sales call, as it is, selling is obviously a thing that you need to be doing throughout the whole process. But I think there are a couple of things that can help you when the thing that in question is an app development project. The first one is to really make sure that you understand the pain that your app is solving and what the return on investment is going to be for the client. So if you were doing a complete theme design rebuild for a client, then you'd be talking about things like increased conversion rates, what it's going to mean for repeat purchases, traffic improvements, things that are quite quantifiable. And it's really, really important that you try and do the same when you're talking about app development, and you start looking at what the ROI is going to be, what are the numbers going to look like. It's very easy, I think, for clients to see app development as a cost center, like, oh, I need to spend 10 grand to get this system to work with Shopify. So instead, you've really got to try and change that conversation and focus in on what the pain points are. So, how many hours a week is this app going to save your staff? If this is a manual process, what would the cost of the business be if someone made a manual error and screwed everything up? So really focus in on those pain points and what the value is that your app is delivering. Especially clients who maybe this is their first app development project, they won't be thinking of it in that terms. They'll be thinking of it as something they have to do rather than something they want to do that'll help their business. This becomes a lot easier also if your app is like directly in the sales funnel for the client. So if it's something that's like doing an upsell pop-up or, God forbid that you do an upsell pop-up, but if you were doing that, then that sort of thing is a lot more measurable. So you can say to the client, well, if this increases your sales by 2% over the month, then there's a fixed number there. If the fixed number is higher than what it's costing to build the app over a period of time, then it's a no-brainer for the client. The second thing, just when it comes to actually selling the client and in your proposals, something that I would really highly recommend is to provide your customer with options. So when it comes to custom app development, very often there's a range of features that are going to be involved in your app, and not all of them are always going to be essential for the app to function. So it's always nice to split it out into absolute core, option A, core plus some nice to haves, option A plus B, and then the kitchen sink, A plus B plus C. And that does two things. Obviously, the pricing is lower, really what you want to be paid for the project, and then retiring on an island somewhere sort of level money. And that does two things. The first thing is that it means that you're capturing money from clients that are price insensitive. So if someone has a massive budget and you don't know that yet, or they just want to sign off on the best possible option, then if you don't give them the opportunity to give you more money, then they can't give you more money, even if they want to or would. So having that option ABC at the bottom is always a good idea, even if they don't go for that. Sometimes it will happen and you'll be pleasantly surprised. And then the second thing is, I think it's a bit of a Matrix-esque illusion of choice thing, but I think having multiple options does something with people's brains, and it changes the decision in their head from, do I hire this person or not, to which of these options do I choose? So they know they're going to hire you, but they lack the illusion of control that they're picking which of those options is going to be best for them. And it sounds a bit weird, or it sounds unlikely, but I have definitely seen this in operation with our clients. My timer is flashing, so I'm going to power through this opportunities section briefly. But what I was going to talk about there is just talking about when you go beyond, when you've done a few of these app development projects, what are some of the opportunities that you would have beyond that to start productizing those apps, to start selling them again and again to multiple clients, pulling out a framework to help the efficiency in the building of those apps, and then also if you wanted to look at moving to the App Store. Again, I'll skip past this, but if you're interested in that, again, come and catch up with me afterwards. So wrapping up, I just wanted to talk about like what are your next steps? If this is interesting to you and you're thinking, oh, well, how would I get started? There's obviously a lot to the world of app development, and you can't just learn that in a 40-minute talk. But what would the next steps be? The first one is to start small. That's a visual gag. So you don't have to jump into like the giant, big custom app development project straight away. There are lots of things that are really valuable for clients that are quite small and simple, and that you can, even if you're a front-end developer that you could pick up in a few hours probably. So things like the data migration tasks that we were talking about before, things about like the script to talk to the Shopify API and change the American English to the English, real English. What do Canadians use? Do they use American English or real English? Don't know. Sorry, I got sidetracked there. But those sort of simple things that are really valuable to merchants, and again, you can swoop in and save the day for something that's actually not that much effort on your behalf, but is really valuable for the merchant. Your other options are to, even if you don't want to do the app development yourself, it's to partner with an agency that does. I don't know who you would look to do that, just, they're around, I imagine. But many agencies would, if you're feeding them work, would be very happy to keep you in on the process and sort of let you see how the sausage is made when it comes to app development, and you can start to pick up some things from there. And did my mic just die? No, came back. You can pick up some things from there and start to learn a little bit more about how that process works. The very final question might be, if you're not... All right, there's not that much left, but we'll do it like this. At the very end, you might be asking, if I can't find... what do I do if I'm not ready to pitch myself to clients as an app developer? Where would I start looking for projects? And I think the answer is very simple. Just talk to your existing clients. Human beings are really, really bad, even reasonably tech-savvy ones are really, really bad at understanding what sort of problems technology is good at solving. So people will battle a spreadsheet for hours and hours and hours and never really think about, is there a better way to do this with computers or something? Just ask your clients what sucks in their business. What is the biggest pain point that you're running into? And there are some really big wins that you can find with just a little bit of custom app development skills that will really make an impact on the business and make you very popular. So that is it for me. Thank you very much.